It gives me great pleasure to introduce our economist, Mark Schweitzer. Mark has a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago in economics and a PhD from UCLA. He was a former senior economist with the Bank of England, and then he spent some time with the Fed, quite a bit of time with the Fed, both with the Kansas City office and with Cleveland's office, in policy roles, in economist roles, external relations roles, and now he's here at Case as a research professor. And this just in, I learned that he received the 2024 Abramson Scroll. The Abramson Scroll, people. This is a big deal. For best paper, right? Best paper in economics research for his work on PPP loans, all right? So please join me in welcoming Mark Schweitzer, who sent me his slides last night. It is fresh. This is fresh info that he's giving us. Thank you, Mark. You get the clicker.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm looking forward to this. I did a lot of forecasts for the Federal Reserve Bank, and I no longer am, but I still, am enjoying the sort of process. The next slide should be my disclaimer. I'm not doing a disclaimer anymore, and I will talk about the election a little bit. So, when I think about a forecast, what I think is really essential is that you start out with a really clear understanding of where you're starting from. And so a lot of what actually changes when an economist says, oh, the forecast got changed, is we had some incoming data, and that incoming data caused us to change the starting point, and that starting point gives us a different forecast. So in that line, we'll be talking about these four things. So we are still in the point where we have to discuss sort of what made the pandemic unique. Because the pandemic is not an ordinary business cycle in any way, shape, or form. And I'll show you multiple dimensions of that. And that's important because we need that to know sort of how we expect to progress. I'll talk about what direction the labor market's going in, because it's gotten a little more uncertain recently. And then I'll definitely talk about inflation. Inflation is a key issue that the Cleveland Fed has long focused on. And I have to not say we there, so I'm avoiding the we, and then I will talk about monetary policy, because that is going to be important for where do we progress towards. And then you need a reliable way to integrate new information. And I'm going to be relying a little bit on the Federal Reserve on this side, because I'm still somewhat tied to that organization. They do pay my pension, after all. Which is good. And then ultimately, and this is where the election's going to come in, is we need to look at critical risks to the outlook. And the outlook was generally put together before the election, and now we have new results. Okay, so let's start with what's unique about the pandemic recovery. And of course, I picked some random things. We got the planes never flying, the boats overloaded, people not in coffee shops. All of those things were big deals. But of course, we're all going, well, we're past that now. And we are to some extent. But, if we think about sort of what's going on in our economy, how much growth do we have not entirely left the pandemic behind, because the pandemic disrupted so many things that it had echoes and echoes and echoes. And particularly in 2022 and 2023, we were still seeing really significant echoes from the pandemic. 2024 has actually started to look a little calmer. And I'm going to show you this. This is a little bit of a complicated chart. And now that I don't have any RAs, I realize just how complicated this chart actually is to produce. But it was really easy for me in the past, and I would just say, Angela, can you get this chart for me? This chart is really helpful, though, when we think about sort of what's underlying the growth in the economy. So the black numbers are GDP growth in the quarter. The bars tell you sort of what produced that growth. And so, consumption is about 70% of GDP. So most of the time, consumption, which is the yellow bars, is going to be a dominant part of what underlies growth in the economy. A nice thing about consumption growth is it's generally pretty steady. It's something that will be reliable and will sort of go on until you hit a recession. So normally consumption growth will be sort of a key part of this. Other parts of this chart, like the blue lines, inventories, those swing up and down. You do not want that to be part of your growth. That's not going to be a reliable source of growth the next quarter. Most of the time, if it was positive one quarter, it'll be negative in the next. So the rest of the components are pretty variable. Now, if we go back a year and we look at what I would have been telling you about last year if I had been here, I'd see that, well, to start, we had 2 negative quarters of growth. Now, some of you might have learned, oh, that makes a recession, but not in the US. We don't view recessions that way. We need more data, and the MBER decides when we have a recession. Part of the reason why the MBER doesn't use 2 quarters is it's quite possible to have relatively solid consumption growth. That actually is pretty stable through this period. But to have large swings in inventories, in net exports, and we had ports and we had different things going on that caused growth to be really low, high, very variable. Those shock waves were still, going on from the pandemic and are still showing up in our GDP data last year. Now, to point out one last thing, I'm going to rescale the 2024 data to actually be on the scale that we're looking at here. So the scale goes from -5 to 10. Well, when we had the pandemic, we had to increase the scale of what sorts of shocks could you see in your economy significantly. Now, if I put today's data on that thing, you'd see, oh, look at how stable that is. And that is kind of where we are on GDP, as we've kind of, isolated ourselves from the day-to-day shocks. Things have gotten a little more stable. We are more reliant on consumption growth, and consumption growth looks steady, and therefore GDP growth will look steadier. There are still some areas that are a little soft or things that we're paying attention to. In this region, I always like to feature a little auto supply. Yeah, we are still a major producer of autos in this region, and things that go into autos. And of course, autos were especially a challenging product right after the pandemic. And that, challenge actually goes right into 2023. And, a lot of the supply chain issues have been resolved. The chips issues have been resolved. But we are seeing, a little bit of a lack of recovery in autos because autos did get really expensive and consumers are just buying fewer of them. And therefore, production looks a little soft too. And it is an interest rate sensitive sector. So, when we're thinking about where are things going, autos is one of those things that I'm a little concerned about, but so far has been pretty stable. When we think about interest rate sensitive sectors, far and away one of the most sensitive sectors, business investment is too, but far and away one of the other ones is the purchase of homes. And we're not really so focused on, existing homes. There are all sorts of challenges there. I thought about having a slide there. I'm not going to do anything about existing homes. But the swing in sort of how many homes are being started is a very persistent swing. So if you look back to the financial crisis, and that's the sort of large gray bar there in 2007-8. And that was a really big recession. Of course, that was very focused on housing. You can see that housing starts had actually, the blue lines had actually been, negative for a while as we went into that recession. But it's a very slow process because even though you've slowed down the housing starts, you actually have to sell the ones that you had. And so sales actually tend to lag. If you look over towards the pandemic, we had a lot of weird fluctuations in housing starts and sales. And that is more or less settled down, but it's kind of settling down to kind of a low level. So we're seeing a relatively weak housing sector, and that's going to be one of the concerns that, is out there, a risk for the economy. higher interest rates do make, builders, kind of uncomfortable. That is a pretty slow process. Hopefully you can see that the blue goes to red with, more than a year lag. So it's a slow process to actually get the housing market going again. Even though when we look out there, we know that housing affordability is a major issue. Okay, so I am going to use and rely a little bit still on the Federal Reserve and its forecast. So let me, this is an important chart. I'm going to use different versions of this. So what this is the FOMC, and those are the people who are setting interest rates for the Federal Reserve. It's all of the governors plus all of the 12 bank presidents. They all submit their forecasts. And, people like me work for the Cleveland Fed. Well, we produce one of the dots that goes into sort of thinking about this forecast. We're one of the 17 submissions. So I know a lot about sort of how these things come about. And it's a pretty reliable forecast. It does pretty well. Now, if you're looking on GDP here, I told you, hey, we've gotten out of the variability that we see in the data. So the blue line is our variability in the past data. Looking out forward, the committee is in reasonable agreement that it's going to be about 2% growth. The red line is the median of the committee, so 17 people. That'll be about 8 people down from the highest forecast. The top little bar there, this is a box and whiskers plot. And so, maybe you saw one of these in statistics. The top of that little line is the topmost forecast. The bottom line is the bottommost, and then the little box in the middle is the central tendencies. Okay, so we'll see this again, but, GDP does not look interesting. That's a good thing. We should be happy about that. This is a stable, reliable, happy, growing, your business should be prosperous sort of chart. We see kind of stable GDP. Now we'll come back to, sort of what are risks at the end. Okay, so overall, I think we've settled into a relatively normal composition of GDP growth that should produce stability, should be kind of a nice forecast horizon. And it's consumption-led growth, and I don't really have any objection to the FOMC forecast of things should be about 2%. That's a reasonable baseline. That said, we're going to talk about risks at the end, and we've had an election. Fiscal policy is a risk. When you have a new administration, they want to have some sort of fiscal policy initiative. That could be tax cuts. That will be something that could alter a growth outlook. More consequentially, though, net exports. So when we think about tariffs, and I am going to look at tariffs at the end, we have to think about net exports, and that could be a big deal for the growth outlook. And of course, just sort of an ongoing thing, interest rates are going to come down a bit. Interest rate sensitive sectors are showing a little signs of weaknesses. So those would be my take on sort of risks when we think about growth. I do like to focus a bit on the labor market. Grant didn't mention, but my technical specialty is labor market. So, I like to cover it. But it's a useful area to think about the near term and really they're both detailed and really timely information comes from the labor market. So if we want to think about the unemployment rate, I like to show a little bit of a longer run pattern on the unemployment rate. And that's actually to give you a little bit of a sense of just how spectacularly significant the pandemic was. So, you can actually take unemployment rate data back further. No matter how far you go until you hit the Great Depression, nothing looks like the pandemic. The Great Depression doesn't look like the pandemic. In the Great Depression, unemployment rose slowly to a very high number. The pandemic just had an instantaneous increase in unemployment. No recession looks like that. They all have gradual growth in unemployment except for the pandemic. So that's just a reminder of how extreme it is. The other thing that doesn't look at all like it is unemployment's decline after the pandemic. Look at how steep that is. And, the initial part of, hey, we want you to come back to work, that makes some sense, and that was very steep. But then if you look at, sort of the Great Recession, so that's sort of 2008 and onward, it took us a really, really long time to get our unemployment rate back down to something close to 4. And we were all kind of stunned when it got down to that low. Following the pandemic, it just dives to those levels really quickly. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on to drive that. Employment picture and employment growth, we lost over 20 million jobs in the pandemic. That is a huge number. And it happens immediately. Unlike the Great Recession, where things kind of gradually go down, and they go down even after the recession's over, it happened right away, and then things started to pick up again. And we've gained back all of that, and we're now at 159 million employees across the United States. The household trends don't really favor robust employment growth from here. So I've added on an extra line here. I've added on the employment to population ratio. So this is similar to an unemployment rate, but it asks what fraction of our people are actually working. And what you can see is that, of course, it's got the same sort of, it declined really steeply in the pandemic, and then it bounced back really nicely after the pandemic. But then it just kind of gradually rises, and then it kind of stagnates around 60%. There are a couple things that are driving this. One is we're getting older. There are a lot of baby boomers in the world. It was the largest generation, in a long time. Many of those people are retiring. That's kind of pulling that down. But yeah, we just haven't seen the full recovery. There are more non-participants in our labor market. And that's going to work as a limit on sort of how much growth can we see in our economy. We can't see that much more employment growth unless we either convince people that, hey, we want you to work longer, and you're going to do it somehow, and we're going to got to convince you to do it. That hasn't been working that well. Or we have to have more immigrants. And immigrants is a sensitive topic these days. So that's going to limit our labor market. What really stood out in the pandemic was even more than the movements of households and their choices about whether they wanted to work or not, was actually the really stunning growth in how businesses wanted to have more employees. So there was a lot of media coverage about quitting and the sort of boost in quitting activities. And you can see that, following the pandemic, the red line here, quitting did rise, and it rose, a full percentage point. That's 50% higher than it was before the pandemic. So that's a pretty big growth in quitting. And of course, when someone quits for working for you, then you've got an opening. And so you're going to have to hire someone to replace the person who quits. So openings, should rise with quits too. And that was kind of a little bit of the story that was in the media. Well, you can see that openings rose a whole lot more than quits did. Businesses just really wanted to have more employees, and they were willing to list. They were listing a lot more listings, a phenomenally larger amount of listings. And so that made for a really tight labor market. That's a labor market where, businesses are looking for employees and they're not finding them. And that was exactly what we experienced. And that puts pressure on wages, that puts pressure on businesses to sort of, find other methods. That has come down. So the environment is getting a lot less tight in the labor market. That number, though, is still consistent with what would have been viewed as a pretty tight labor market in the pre-pandemic period. It is a lot less tight than we've been, so it feels more comfortable as a hiring person. The hiring managers are going to feel a little better about their circumstances, but it's still a reasonably tight level. Why do openings matter so much? Because openings actually do a pretty good job of predicting where wages and salaries are growing. So when we saw high openings, we saw higher wages and salaries. When it started to come down, wages and salary growth, not the actual salaries or the wages, but the growth in wages and salaries did slow as well. So that's going to be important when we think about inflation, because for many businesses, in particular services, wages and salaries are the vast majority of their costs. So when we think about the labor market, the FOMC focuses on the unemployment rate. The FOMC has been predicting for a little while that the unemployment rate would rise. And it actually has been rising. So we are seeing a little rise in unemployment. Most of the time when you see a rise in unemployment, a recession's around the corner, especially if you've actually seen like a 0.5 percentage point. That does not seem to be today's case. We've been able to sort of maneuver and see a slight rise in unemployment without the labor market or conditions sort of, causing people to worry. And people have worried, but, sentiment has not dipped. Behavior on hiring hasn't changed. It still looks like a solid labor market. And the committee is forecasting that will continue. I think it's pretty amazing that we've managed to see unemployment heading gradually higher without hurting sentiment. But that's what we've got. And so the FOMC median forecast does look like a pretty reasonable baseline. It's basically just saying we're going to keep today's unemployment rate as long as growth is stable. And so the main labor market risk is really about the supply of labor. And with immigration being constrained, actually, if immigration stays the way that it has been recently, which is not that high, we would have to, we need our employment growth number to go down to about 50,000 a month. That's kind of how many extra, people we're sort of producing out of our own demographics and the existing immigration trend. So it's going to be an environment where we're going to be working with the employees we have. We're not going to be counting on growth from just sort of inherent population growth. And this is true for the next 10 years. I mean, the Census Bureau does an analysis of sort of demographics to sort of say what's the underlying growth rate of employment. And it is 55,000 people per month for the next 10 years. Okay, so how about inflation? Has the inflation surge finally passed? Is the question that I've offered here. I've actually been using these little pictures for a while now. I mean, the menu looks kind of affordable these days. And the gasoline prices are actually down quite a lot. So that's one of those things. Eggs are also down. There was this bird flu. And the rent, probably most people still think it's too high. Okay, so when we look at inflation, though, we want to put it on official measures. The FOMC has an objective set for 2% on PCE inflation. Headlines actually basically down to that already. Core is taking food and energy out of it. And when we do that, we end up with a little higher inflation now because energy prices have been dipping more quickly than other prices. And I like to look at things that are called trim means or medians. It looks across all of the products that are in your basket of goods that you have in your inflation rate and says, what's the middle product? And then that middle product kind of determines what your inflation rate is. And that's kind of a good indication for sort of where general prices are going. So I see this as, more or less a cup half full. We've generally seen broad-based declines in inflation. The measures that are kind of measuring the underlying level of inflation are still showing a little higher rate. So they have not gotten all the way down to sort of 2% yet. And officially, the headline inflation is 2.1. If I had shown you a 6-month chart, it would actually be below the inflation objective. All right, so I have I'm teaching various classes. I'm teaching principles this year. And so I started out my principles class by asking everyone, what's your main issue that you want to learn about? And the students, 90% of them said inflation. 90%. I mean, students are all like, hey, this inflation thing, it matters. And we've definitely seen the inflation thing matters. So it's not something you can attack with just any set of tools. This was a very complicated inflation pattern. It's not what the regular models were suggesting. So a recent paper by Ben Bernanke, somewhat known in the world, he's got a Nobel Prize and is a former chair of the Federal Reserve, and Olivier Blanchard, who might be a little less familiar to people, but he's an MIT professor who used to be the chief economist for the IMF. These two produced a paper that analyzes wages and prices and puts together a model that includes wages, prices, and inflation expectations. They use this model to actually estimate what happened during the pandemic. So they actually build the model out of pre-pandemic data, but make it so that it can actually predict the pandemic inflation. And then they find that most of it was not really driven by overheated labor markets. It really was the result of particular shocks. Commodity prices. I know there's some supply chain people. I talked to someone who was a supply chain person. That's great. Supply chain issues were huge. And of course, the sectoral spikes, the oil price shocks, the food prices that came from the Ukraine war, all of those things are really, really important to sort of what happened to inflation. I want to first show you, hey, does the model fit? So remember, they use pre-pandemic data to come up with what is a model of inflation. They don't want to use any of the pandemic information. We want to say, okay, we're going to build a model that will, actually work during the pandemic based on estimates before it. Their model works. They've got actual data in blue and the simulated sort of what does the model tell you in red. So that's a pretty good fit. As somebody who's run some models, that's a really good fit. Okay, so then they're able to use that fit to explain sort of what drove the pandemic inflation process. And again, this is one of those things where you've got kind of the larger the block is in a color, that's when it's the more consequential. So I think the easiest one to start with is the blue block. So the blue is energy prices. And so, right after the pandemic, gasoline prices dropped to, really low levels because nobody was driving their car around. So energy prices were really low. They jump up and then get really high during the sort of early parts of the Ukraine war. Okay. So food prices are light blue. They clearly had similar influences. A harder thing maybe to see is the initial conditions. So this model has to build in what was our inflation rate from the past that is going to feed into today's inflation rate. And they basically are saying, the initial conditions of our economy were about 2%, a little over 2% inflation. And this is on a CPI basis. So this would be very close to a 2% PCE inflation rate. All right, now the red thing is V over U, and that's a very obscure thing, but I'm going to actually show you what that means. But that is labor market tightness. So we probably forget the sort of early part of the pandemic actually had some pretty loose labor markets. But over time, that's gotten to be a more meaningful fraction of our employment. But it does not, it's kind of dominated by the yellow lines and the blue lines. So the kind of, tan on this screen. That is the sort of supply shortages. That's the chips, that's the ports, that's the, getting things from one place to another. That was a very big factor, actually, in a lot of our inflation, that combined with energy. And the labor market is a positive factor, but it's not so large in their very good estimates. So I told you I'd tell you a little bit about V over U. So I told you about openings, and I said openings are really kind of the extraordinary thing about this labor market. V over U kind of takes the openings part, and we call those vacancies in economics, and then we divide it by the number of unemployed people who are available to work. And that ratio hit 2. So there were twice as many job openings as there were unemployed people. That's clearly an environment where, wages are going to be under some pressure. We'll be offering more. An employer who wants to actually fill one of those vacancies, they got to offer a higher wage. That is down to just above 1 now. It is still, kind of comparable to pre-pandemic levels. But I didn't show you this, or I didn't highlight that, Mr. Bernanke and Blanchard, they stopped their analysis in 2023. And labor markets were one of their main concerns on sort of ongoing inflation. Well, since that time, we've actually seen continued reductions in the labor market tightness measure. So their labor market tightness thing is now down to sort of no longer an influence on the inflation forecast. So we do see things generally kind of settling down on inflation. And so while I'm still nervous about, and I can assure you that the committee members who submit their projections, the bank presidents and the governors, are all still very nervous about inflation, it is looking pretty reasonable to say, yeah, we can hit that 2% target, and we're very close to it, and it can be sort of what future inflation looks like. There are, however, some risks. So it is coming down smoothly. I am still a little concerned about residual pressures. I would be on the high side of those FOMC estimates. I think the people who are concerned, have good reason to be concerned even before we get to the risks. So the risks that we're looking at from, sort of following the election, the sort of possibility of tariffs, the limited labor supply, and fiscal policy proposals, every one of those is an upside risk to inflation. Those things were not built into the FOMC's baseline forecast. So those risks are real, and I will take on one of them. Okay, so how is monetary policy positioned? So this used to be my disclaimer slide. I would put up a beautiful picture of the Cleveland Fed. Cleveland Fed's the nicest of the Federal Reserve buildings by far. I'm sure you all agree. And often people show the Board of Governors, that's a boring building. Look at this, it's a fabulous building. We love Cleveland. Okay, so what are we going to say about the monetary policy? We have seen interest rates come down, so the FOMC has been lowering the federal funds rate. It moved 25 basis points just last week, and it had moved 50 before that. So the fact that inflation has come down close to objective means that we can have lower interest rates than we've got currently. They're not extraordinarily high, going back to sort of what we saw before the pre-pandemic, but they're a lot higher still than what we saw going into the pandemic. And there's kind of complicated things called the natural rate of interest rates. I'm not going to talk to you about that. That's way too complicated for a general audience. So the FOMC has been and continues to expect to lower rates in the coming year and in the remainder of this year. So many members think that and the dots are each one of the individual members here rather than the fancy box and whisker plot. Each one of these dots remembers a particular member of the committee's view on what they think interest rates should end the year of 2024 at and 2025. So this is a picture where we think interest rates, need to continue to decline, in particular the Fed funds rate. And that process should be over by next year, because we should be on inflation target and our unemployment rate will be close to the FOMC's objective of full employment. Now, what's my take on the policy outlook? Well, the FOMC has achieved lowering inflation, something that is not easily done, with a very soft landing, with only a slight increase in unemployment. And that environment should give you a rates reduction. We should see lower interest rates just because they're too high for what our conditions will be. But policy going forward is going to depend very much on what data do we actually see. So yesterday we had a CPI report. I know you were all, sitting on your hands just waiting for it to come out like I was. But it was a solid report. It was up slightly, but fundamentally it did not alter our sort of picture on sort of where we think inflation's going. But any bad shock there will make people nervous again about inflation. So we're likely to see some bumps just because the data normally has a little bit of bumpiness to it. But yeah, the outlook, the baseline, definitely supports the FOMC lowering the Fed funds rate. I mean, I think, they should probably continue even if there are little bumps along the way. I'm not sure they will, but they probably should. That said, we've got the upside risks on inflation are the dominant concern in this outlook. I think growth should be steady. There are things that you might worry about there, but the dominant concern has to be inflation. Tight labor markets, the sort of limited growth on employment, and tariffs. And so any one of those things, could keep the Fed funds rate higher. So if we kind of move along and we think those are realistic, we're gonna be nervous. So what about the election? So this is where, actually I would have been not talking so much about some of those risks either, but this is where the disclaimer, kind of weighs in. I don't talk, and Federal Reserve officials don't talk about elections. And Chair Powell was asked about how the election results might change the outlook at the FOMC press conference. He did an absolutely fabulous job of emphasizing that there wasn't enough information on policy changes to pin down any changes to the outlook. Basically, I don't want to answer that question. Leave me alone. No, he did and that there is, that is still kind of true. But he said the staff will generate alternative scenarios. And this is very much true. Part of the FOMC process, part of how we integrate information in is we generate alternative scenarios to pin down sort of what possible things are out there and the risks. And any sort of policy change that is as large as the ones that we're thinking about are generating alternative scenarios. And this is why you have all of those economists employed. And these scenarios, as he says, eventually get incorporated into the outlook. So if we go along and one of these policy changes is going to happen, we incorporate that into the outlook. So, yeah. So I worked at in the Fed system for 30-some years. I've seen a lot of green books, and I was like, I pretty much remember there was one where we had a really nice, analysis of tariffs. And it is true. And conveniently enough, it's more than 5 years old. So it's actually publicly available now. So the staff has already evaluated what happens when you have high trade barriers. What's a high trade barrier? So it says, assume the United States increases tariffs on all imported goods by 15 percentage points, and that foreign economies impose a similar sized increase in tariffs on U.S. exports. Not an incredible number, actually, given recent opinions. And it concludes that you'd see a widespread and sustained increase in trade barriers would likely result in profoundly adverse effects. So I'm actually going to go through what those effects look like. But I want to point out two things here. It needs to be widespread. This is not about, sort of, we're going to focus some tariffs on China. This is about we're going to put tariffs on everything. And, that is credible because that is one of the things that is a stated policy that's been proposed. And that these things need to be sustained. So actually, if you look back at 2018, 2019, there were a lot of trade tensions. They were actually influencing what did the Federal Reserve think about our outlook. And they actually caused interest rates to decline because they were having negative effects on our output. At the same time, even the Trump administration at that time actually was going through, hey, we're going to roll back some of this. We're going to negotiate with China. So it could be that, trade tariffs or tariffs are not actually sustained, that you see them announced and then you see them pulled back in some sense. So this scenario, I want you to know, is about them being continued, that we put them up and we stick with them, and so do our trading partners. All right, so in that environment, if you have higher tariffs, it has little effect on the trade balance. So this uses a pretty sophisticated model, and it says that both imports and exports are down. And they're down roughly equally, and we have the same trade deficit that we had before. So that's kind of the first result. And then it says, well, we're going to have higher costs on consumption goods, and that will depress household spending. So this is, who's paying for the tariffs? The ultimate consumer pays for the tariff, and consumers don't like higher prices. Nothing really surprising there. That is what economists have been saying about tariffs for a really long time. Higher costs are not just limited to consumers. They affect capital goods, and they lower the profits of businesses that are importing things. And they lower the profits of businesses that are exporting things. So, it results in higher costs and lower profits, and that will depress business fixed income. Am I going to invest when my profits are low? I invest less. Not an unusual result either. And then finally, perhaps this is where the sophisticated model and all the extra economists come in, is that economists tend to view tariffs as bad for productivity growth. Why is that? Well, the businesses that actually do well under tariffs are the ones that are producers that are competing with foreign producers. They're pretty good companies, but they're not actually the highest productivity companies in the U.S. So those companies are going to expand, and they will become a larger share of our companies and our output, and they're relatively below average productivity. The really highly productive companies in the U.S. are the exporters. They actually are going to be producing less, and they will get smaller. So our balance of productivity in our firms actually shifts towards relatively low productivity firms. So that's kind of a subtle thing that you don't often see when you think about sort of, hey, what do tariffs do? That's a long-run cost to the economy. Okay. I can tell everyone's like, oh, this is not going to be good. And the answer is, yeah, this is not a nice-looking scenario. So let's look at inflation. Tariffs are a one-time change. So a one-time change in prices boosts inflation, but it doesn't persist. You can see that we hit an inflation rate of about 4% sort of from the baseline that looked pretty attractive. So this is showing you the data. It's not as bad as the pandemic. That's good. But it's a big inflation number. It is well above the FOMC's objective. What does it do to GDP? High tariff barrier would actually generally be viewed as producing a recession. It's sort of an automatic recession. It's not a terribly deep recession. It's one, and like I said, remember, it has to be sustained tariffs. If they get kind of pulled back when we get nervous, maybe we don't hit a recession. Tariffs are not good for GDP growth. The fact that you're going to have less exports, the fact that you're going to have less imports, the fact that consumers are unhappy with their higher prices, the fact that businesses are not investing, none of those things is good for GDP. That's why you get a recession. What does it do to unemployment? Unemployment doesn't just sort of disappear when you have a recession. It stays high. So we would have a longer period of unemployment. So what's my take on the high tariff barriers scenario? I mean, the specifics of tariffs are still unknown. A 15% across the board thing is not impossible. And it's not something that, you're not going to get many economists to say, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And I'm not going to say it either. So, the details of the environment that we're in at the time are going to matter. This is about sort of how big are the effects given our baseline. But and we would need to evaluate how our trading partners would respond. So when we look back at the data, and one of my colleagues, sent me a piece by Lighthizer, who was the trade representative during the first Trump administration, about how great everything had been with tariffs. And I looked at all of the items of data that he cited, and I'm like, none of these things are actually true when you go look at the data. The period where we had tariffs was actually a little bit of a soft period for GDP growth. It had real costs. It would have been boosting inflation, but inflation was kind of below the FOMC's objective at the time, so we didn't really worry about the fact that it was pushing up prices. And one of the things that happened, though, was that our trading partner, and in this case it was primarily China, was really in a difficult position. So they, probably were a little more flexible than usual. If we have across-the-board tariffs, that's going to be other trading partners. That will include Mexico, who's already announced they will offset our tariffs. That would include Canada, who's a very big trading partner. And, I don't think they're going to say, oh, yeah, you guys have a tariff. We'll just sit on our hands. Europe has already said they will fully offset, and they did offset when they were faced with tariffs. So we still have to evaluate how the trading partners react. And I want to say, one last thing is, this is one single model. This one single model, but it basically reflects what most business economists and economists would view about substantial tariff increases. That said, there's not a lot of recent data. We have not had a broad-based tariff increase in a really, really, really long time. So overall, hey, remember the baseline. I don't feel, people are probably not that cheery now, but our baseline was really good, people. What we were entering into this environment on is a really strong economy where we lowered inflation, we achieved moderate growth, and we've gotten extremely low unemployment rates. That said, there's no question that what I'm telling you today is that I mostly see upside risks on inflation and downside risks on growth when I think about, sort of what policies are being discussed. And I hope that we can avoid some of those. So with that, I am officially over, and I think we get to have questions. And I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much. Rex has a question over there.
There you go. Thank you. One of the things you didn't talk about is federal debt.
Yes.
And the amount of money that has to be raised to roll over the debt that's out there, the competition that is going to do for corporate rates. You talked about declining Fed rates, but in fact, the 10-year, since they've been taking rates down, are actually up substantially.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about federal debt, would you, and the implications on the economy looking forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That was, there were enough slides there probably, but I excluded the ones that I've been working on interest rates. The fact that the 10-year Treasury actually did rise, even though the Fed funds rate has fallen, is a big deal because it's actually a better indicator for what the costs of funding for households and businesses are like. 10-year Treasuries are very close to sort of what the mortgage interest rate would be. So when I pointed out, hey, the risks that I see on the outlook are still on sort of GDP, are still on the interest rate sensitive sectors, that's because we haven't seen the decline in interest rates. There are multiple possible underlying factors. One is a sort of, some of the market has higher inflation expectations, and that's keeping the 10-year up. I think on balance, I would agree with you that a lot of it is we've got a lot of debt, and the market, is just requiring a higher rate to meet that debt. That is absolutely a concern. It's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit concerned about the whole fiscal policy side of initiatives. That the primary ones they're talking about are tax cuts. We have pretty clear, we're pretty clear on sort of what do tax cuts do to the deficit. They increase the government, deficit, and will add to the debt. So, yeah, I'm with you. I'm concerned about that. This is an economy. If I'm thinking about, sort of conventional economics, this is an economy where you want to see the deficit coming down. You don't want to see it going up. And that would help with the interest costs of businesses. I do see, those as, likely to be, higher than they were sort of pre-pandemic. I intentionally excluded the sort of natural rate and sort of thinking about what's the underlying interest rate. But, essentially this environment is one where the natural rate is ending up higher. That means that all interest rates are kind of ending up higher. They were probably a little too low pre-pandemic, so some of that might have been sort of the amount of funds that were going into purchasing treasuries and other investments in the U.S. Those were extraordinarily high pre-pandemic. That probably doesn't happen with the tariff environment either. So, yeah, it's complicated. There's always a lot underlying in interest rates, but I do expect interest rates to stay higher at the actual sort of consumer and business endpoint of those interest rates. Yeah.
Go ahead. You spoke to energy a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
With the adoption of electronic vehicles coming into play and AI with all the chip makers that are coming out, the electrical grid seems to be not there to support it. What is your take, or can you talk about that a little bit about energy and the cost increases going up over the next couple of years?
Yeah. So that is a substantive and real policy issue to sort of think through sort of how do we make our energy transfer system more electricity focused, and that requires investment. And so that there's kind of a question that, that makes sense. And we will see a little bit of increase in electricity prices. But when we look at the sort of inflation outlook, that is still totally driven by fossil fuel. So from your standpoint, that's not as consequential. I mean, the bigger deal on sort of inflation or sort of energy prices would be sort of what's the natural gas price, for example, at this point still. Even though we are managing to shift more into renewables, even though that there's a lot of... So there's a long-term issue that you're raising that absolutely has to get addressed. That will involve some additional costs to electricity users, but it's not the dominant thing that's driving sort of energy prices in the sort of near-term forecasts. That's still oil. So oil's still dominant in that space.
To a different sort of unusual or unintended consequence.
Yes.
As you look at housing in the construction market, where the openings are significantly higher in terms of opportunity, and you have the possibility of 12 to 13 million deportations, what's the view on the available labor pool to support the significant shortfall in housing and the impact to the economy?
This is not I don't know. It's not good. There's not a lot of official data on sort of how many immigrants are working in construction, because there's a view that a lot of that is illegal. We think we do count them in the actual employment counts. They are employment in construction, is a pretty big employer of relatively low-skilled, mostly male workers. And immigration may be one of the sort of challenges there. It's not a place in which, so there's kind of, when we think about immigration, there's a lot of focus on illegal immigration. There's a lot of really important legal immigration that, may be impacted as well. So, in the prior Trump administration, there were raids on chicken processing plants. They have a similar, they've got relatively low-skill workforce that, tended to be immigrants. Interestingly enough, I was reading a pretty informative news article that was saying actually a lot of the people who were rounded up and were deported are back in the U.S. again. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And it turns out most of them are legal now. So the chicken processors managed to go through a process to say, hey, we need people to actually work at our plants, and got visas, and got sort of temporary work visas for a lot of their employment. Both of those two things are sensitive right now. Both of them are kind of uncertain. That's kind of why I'm concerned about, lots of different areas of where we've been relying on, a sort of largely immigrant working population, legal and illegal and temporary. The whole thing about Dayton was about a plant that actually is employing people legally who have, temporary status, that they need those workers. So I don't know how we solve that. But it definitely will be it could be a pretty large constraint, because we don't have the domestic growth in our population, and we don't have the unemployed people to replace all of that. We just don't. So we've been relying on immigration, and yeah, I don't know how we don't.
Left field question. I'd like to enlarge the lens a little bit and ask if you see possible international dislocation from the emerging, what is very clearly an emerging Cold War with hot corners to it, and its effect not just on tariffs, but on disaggregating and polarizing supply chains, and especially on the dollar in light of an emerging alternative international trade currency coming out of China, which, as it grows, could threaten the dollar's position as the international trading currency. Is this a possible dislocation, serious dislocation, like the pandemic was, down the road?
Yeah. So this is, so definitely in my prior role, the official response is no. And I actually more or less still think that that's the case. I don't think we're in an environment where renminbi or that we will see an alternative currency to replace the dollar. The dollar is actually, if anything, on the overly strong side now. So now I'm thinking about it, I should have put that on my wrist too. Oh, I did have net exports on GDP growth. Yeah, the dollar is really strong now. I don't see the U.S. dollar being supplanted, and in part it's because the overall world businesses don't have a reason to switch. It's not advantageous to be tied to Chinese currency. In fact, if the Chinese businesses would probably say they'd be happier being tied to the dollar if they could manage to do that. They can't manage to do that because they're capital controls. When you do capital controls because you can't manage your sort of monetary policy without it. So China is still not in a position where that currency can replace the dollar. So I'd say the euro has a better chance of being a long-term replacement of the dollar than the dollar, but I don't see that happening either.
What about the supply chains?
Supply chains, I think that is an ongoing risk. There is absolutely. I was talking. I'm still a Fed guy in many ways that I approach things. I always like to ask businesses about, what do you know? Tell me about how you're seeing the supply chain. And supply chains are absolutely fascinating, and they continue to be a challenge. They are much less of a challenge than they were during the pandemic, but there's absolutely reasons to say they could go back to that sort of pandemic level of challenge really quickly. So that is just one of those risks that's out there. on balance, the baseline, I'd say, we shouldn't assume that's going to happen. Is it something that we should kind of think through? How do we respond when it happens? Yeah, we should be thinking through that. Those are real risks. I mean, the supply chain is a continuing and ongoing worry. And I think, without any tariffs, without any sort of trade barrier changes, there was already some movement of, we need to have this activity onshore or near shore or on a friendly shore. There was already kind of a sort of building in sort of, hey, we need to shorten up some of our reliance. And I think that's going to be ongoing. So kind of regardless of trade policy, I think, we might have achieved kind of the maximum globalization that we're going to see in sort of at least, the next couple decades. And we were already kind of pulling back a little bit from that. And I think, that's kind of what you're pointing at. I think some of that will continue regardless. That's already kind of built into the baseline. Because supply chains have been real, they were huge problems. They were huge problems in the post-pandemic period. I mean, actually, the pandemic, it wasn't such a big deal, but the post-pandemic period, they were really big supply chain issues, and I think everybody's more nervous about them today.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the presentation. Great to see. So I work with a number of U.S.-based manufacturers who were excited about the tariffs. I mean, they manufacture everything in the United States. They believe that the tariffs in general will make them more competitive.
Yeah.
They can increase profit, then they can invest that in automation to make their products less expensive and ultimately provide that to the U.S. I just, given the insights on tariff leading to inflation, lower GDP, less innovation, I'm actually curious if there are U.S.-based manufacturers, here today who, maybe somebody could share their insights and thoughts on if the tariffs will essentially, impact your innovation efforts, positively or negatively. If there's any manufacturer who could speak on that.
I'd be happy to hear from anybody who wants to. There's absolutely winners and losers in tariffs. And so if you're on the relative winner side, you're a domestic producer and your sort of world market or your sort of domestic, your U.S. price is going to be higher because of tariffs. You're going to be, more profitable and you will actually invest and you will improve sort of your productivity. All of that's true. But that doesn't actually offset the fact that, exporters are on balance, significantly more productive than the typical import substituter. And so those exporters and the companies who are, U.S. producers, but you import, a significant part of your product inputs, both of those two entities are in a much more difficult position. So do those firms exist? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there was a really interesting article in, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, about the last hanger manufacturer in the U.S. And he makes wire hangers, and he's a really cool company. I love those sorts of things. But that's I don't think that's not probably the future of manufacturing that we should think about in the U.S. We absolutely should keep it. Everybody who can produce ought to be producing, but we shouldn't be trying to make ourselves the wire hanger producers of the world. That might have been my more controversial statement.
We'd be really impacted by the tariffs, particularly because most of our components come from China.
Yeah.
They're talking about 60 to 80%. So we've already made significant investments, and it's just going to be hard to hold on to. And I'm already seeing how much of our time and energy is going to go towards alternative sourcing and managing this created crisis. It's really going to be devastating for us if it goes through as planned.
Which is not good for me personally. Earthquaker, guitar pedals, guitarist. We want those prices low. Leslie?
There are two trends that I am watching, and I'm wondering, with your interest in labor and workforce, whether these two trends have any impact on the hard measures of economy. The two trends are our largest generation, called the boomers, are both retiring and succeeding their companies. But guess what? They're not retiring. They are staying in the workforce. What impact does that have on the economy and on labor? The second question is, the pandemic resulted in us discovering that we could work both remotely and hybrid. And in companies really staying in that workplace landscape, I, an organizational behaviorist, am concerned about things bleeding away like culture and values and connectivity and loyal and trustworthiness, harder to measure than the hard stuff.
Yeah.
But what do these two trends of people not retiring, the boomers' big succession of companies, and are not sort of coming back into the community of work but staying remote and hybrid, have any impact on economic numbers?
Well, you went from two trends to three trends, but I actually I think they're all pretty fascinating, and I'm happy to talk about each one of them. So on the boomers, it is absolutely the case that at any given age, boomers are less likely to retire than the prior generation. The thing that I said there was at any given age. And as you move out ages, boomers are still more likely to retire. So what that's impacting is that employment to population, the share of our population that's working, has been flat, even though we've been seeing a recovering economy. A lot of that is actually the sort of, the aging of the baby boom generation. So it is you're absolutely right. At any given age, they're less likely to retire than prior generations. That's good. We need to keep some of these people. That said, as they get out towards 70, which is definitely in that sort of population now, or 75, the retirement rates are, or the likelihood that you're still in the labor market is significantly lower, even for the baby boom generation. So we are going to see pressures. So that was kind of trend one. That's definitely something that was there in, now I'm forgetting trend two. Succession. So yeah, there has been really, it's been complicated, especially in the small manufacturing world, to sort of deal with succession. And I've been it's a subtle thing. I don't really have a lot of data on it, but it's actually gone a little better than I might have guessed, sort of building out. And we've seen not as many, sort of closures as, might have guessed. I mean, I think on the sort of business side, I mean, that's one of those things that's kind of fuzzy, but underlying sort of the sort of good-looking GDP, sort of stable environment. The last one was about work from home and hybrid. The bank went hybrid while I was there. We were at, we came back to 3 days a week was kind of the new standard for. And businesses are definitely struggling with how do they think about, about that and how happy are they with that. That from an economist standpoint on the hard data is what do I think is happening to productivity growth? And there's a, fascinating, sort of back and forth debate about productivity growth and sort of at home or not at home. Organizational behaviorists are on the side of, hey, we need culture in our businesses. Other people are like, hey, there was a lot of wasted time out in the world commuting and, being in offices. So both sides are duking it out. So far, the productivity data is not showing that we have seen any sort of large shift either up or down. So it's still kind of unresolved. I mean, I think it's going to be an important sort of business cultural question as much as it is, a sort of data question. We got a question.
All right, I think this is last one.
Oh, he's the lucky winner of the last question. Better be a hard one.
Yeah, we'll see. Thank you so much for the information. My name is Anurag. I work for Bridgestone Tire Company. You talked about some of the new administration's policies regarding tariffs and looser fiscal policy. But there's also this creation of this new Department of Government Efficiency, which plans to cut government spending by $2 trillion, if I'm reading that correctly, which would potentially have impact on the GDP, I would imagine. So what do you think would be some of the scenarios to think about from that angle, and if the looser fiscal policy can balance that out, if possible?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to do my best Chairman Powell imitation here and try to. No, it's a really hard question. That's kind of one of the. Some policies you can look at and say, I picked tariffs because, one, they're really big, and they're a leading item that the administration's pushing. So, but they're also relatively clear. And we know kind of how to model them, how to think about it. On the government efficiency department, I don't know what to expect. I do not understand. I mean, $2 trillion's a lot. If you take $2 trillion out of, probably most of you took economics classes, you probably remember there's Y plus C plus I plus G. G is sort of what we normally use when we think about sort of what's a big shock to the economy, and we can have like some sort of tax reduction, we can have extra government spending, and that kind of boosts activity, and that's kind of your typical macro class. $2 trillion is a lot of money to take out of government, and I don't know what the horizon is, but that's a lot. As an economist, I'm worried, that somebody who might not find economic statistics as kind of important. I think businesses actually ought to care about economic statistics. They do help us make better choices. And, knowing sort of what the inflation rate is, or knowing how much output we have, or what our employment is, all of these things are really kind of consequential. So I'm a little bit nervous about what is it going to do to the government statistics agencies, because nobody typically, sticks up for them. And I hope that people do, because I generally, I feel that a more informed economy is a better economy. So I hope that they somehow make it through this government efficiency process.
All right, so I said one more, but there's really, I'm going to keep saying one more.
I guess I wanted to ask a question about like the job market aspect you covered in the slides. What do you see potentially like an increase in jobs available, especially for like recent college graduates with this new economy in the next 4 years? And like, can you just speak on that if you think there's like hope, or it's not looking too good?
That's actually pretty easy. So it's true that openings are down, and that we're not in the sort of hyper tight labor market of 2 years ago. That said, it's not a bad labor market. We are not in a recessionary labor market. I know something about finishing your education and then entering a recession. That's actually part of how I came to Cleveland, is I figured I would be teaching out on the West Coast. And then when I finished my PhD, there was a recession. That actually is kind of useful to remember that, recessions and big numbers look like, hey, I shouldn't be hopeful. That's not really true. Most of the time, our labor market still has lots of needs. There are 10 times as many, sort of jobs that are going to get filled as there is employment change. I told you, hey, labor market we don't have some of the growth aspects that we had before. So I actually think it shouldn't be at all a bad time to exit, from an education program.
All right, now,
always sensitivities about sort of exactly which fields are, doing well at any given time. But yeah, it shouldn't be a bad time.
Okay, this really is the last question.
That's what he said the last time.
Well, with the Federal Reserve, the government's talked about wanting a seat at the table with the Securities Exchange. And I'm kind of curious as far as what you feel that'll have as an impact for our country.
Yeah, one of the things you teach when you're teaching macroeconomics is that an independent central bank is your best strategy. That research was done a long, long time ago. Economists kind of worldwide believe that, hey, you want to have an independent central bank because otherwise you're prone to sort of making the inflationary choice. To choose, hey, I'd rather have a few more jobs today than low inflation. And at any given time, that's kind of the dilemma that, the central bank solves for you is we do care about employment. We do consider that part of our I'm saying we. I need to not say that. The Federal Reserve does say that that's part of its dual mandate. But, the other side of that is inflation. And so removing the sort of independent central bank or leaning too heavily on the central bank has been shown in the past to produce more inflation. I didn't cite that as a risk. The end of the Chair Powell's press conference, where he was not really dodging any questions, but no, the end of his press conference was, if you're asked to resign, would you? And the answer was no. Not just no, but we're actually prepared to fight. We will fight that in the courts because the independent central bank is part of our legal system. It is enshrined in the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act has been there for a long time. I don't think anyone has the appetite to reconsider it. And I hope they don't.
Great. So let's thank Dr. Schweitzer again, winner of the Abramson Scroll.